Hi, I'm Deborah Lafayette. I'm one of the ministers at St. Paul's United Church in Oakville, and I'd like to welcome you to this event that we are celebrating near Pi Day. It's March 13th. Pi Day is 3.14 or Pi, and we are celebrating being public, intentional, and explicit. 3 churches in the region, 3 affirming churches, got together to create an event. St. Paul's United Church in Oakville, Port Nelson United Church in Burlington, and Applewood United Church in Mississauga. And we invited others to join us, those who are in the process, those who are thinking about being in the process, and others. And we invited our guest speaker, Michael Blair. Before we get into an introduction of Michael Blair, I just want to acknowledge the territory on which we are on. I'll acknowledge my own territory here in Oakville. These are the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Attawandaron, and the Anishinaabe, and then the Métis people. And more recently, the current stewards are the Mississaugas of the Credit. I acknowledge that naming this territory is only one step in our reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples, and that we have a long ways to go. I invite you to think about where you are located. There are websites out there that will help you. I'm going to try and put a link in the YouTube notes if you'd like to use a link to research and find out, as a settler, if you are a settler in this land, who are the traditional peoples. So I'm now going to pass it along to Thea Sheridan-Jonah, who is our co-chair at St. Paul's United Church of our affirming team, and she's going to introduce us to our very special guest speaker today, Michael Blair.
Hi, my name is Thea. I am the co-chair of the St. Paul's Affirming Committee. We are so excited to have you here to watch the recording of this amazing event. We are so thankful to Michael for coming and talking to us, and I can't wait to introduce him to all of you. So I have a short bio of his to read. It's not everything. He has done so much, but this is a short intro so you know a bit more about him before hearing his amazing talk. So Reverend Michael Blair is a member of the Order of Ministry in the United Church of Canada and currently serves the General Council of the United Church of Canada as the General Secretary, a role he began November 1st, 2020. In his time at the General Council office, he has served as Executive Minister for Ethnic Ministry, Executive Minister of Communities in Ministry, and Executive Minister of Church and Mission. Before joining the General Council office staff, Michael served as Executive Director of the Toronto Christian Resource Centre, which was a ministry of the then Toronto South Presbytery, now Shining Waters region. Michael was admitted to the Order of Ministry in 2010 and has previously served as a congregational minister of a number of Baptist churches in Toronto and St. Catharines. A staff member with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at the University of Toronto and as a community chaplain with the Ontario Multi-Faith Council's Reintegration Program. We are so excited to have Michael here to talk to all of us today, so let's get right into it.
So it's going to require from us a lot of intentionality, and the intentionality is connected with both an ability to acknowledge differences and attentiveness to the situation. And let me just quickly illustrate a little bit about intentionality in a different kind of way. Since November, I've assumed the role as General Secretary of the United Church. One of the issues I've discovered since November is that the voice of Michael Blair has been lost. Anything I say is heard as the General Secretary. And so one of the things I've realized is that I have to be intentional about what I say. I can't speak off the cuff, as has been my past sometimes, just kind of somebody asks me a question and I respond to it Now I have to think about how I'm responding to it because it gets heard not as the opinions of Michael Blair, but as the opinions of the General Secretary. So I think it's important that when we think about intersectionality, we also think about how intentional we are, and I think that intentionality raises question about in the context of affirming, what does it mean? What does safety mean? And let me illustrate that a little bit. So I'm so you have somebody who is gay and is, for all kinds of reason, not out publicly about their identity. They want to be part of a faith community. So they go to a faith community. Having a rainbow flag on a building that they go to may be threatening because they may fear that somebody will see them going into a building with a rainbow flag and they're outed. Now, there are all kinds of issues we can think about why the person isn't out and all that kind of stuff, but we'll get to that. But so in one way, a symbol that creates a measure of safety for some folks becomes a symbol of fear for others, not because they're homophobic, but because their social situation is a challenge to them. So they, somebody sees them going into a building with a flag, and it may participate, illicit conversation that they're not prepared to do. So when I talk about as we engage this, the need for analysis, the need for intentionality is important. The need to acknowledge difference and the recognition that we're not all the same. And this goes against, in some ways, some of our own kind of theological formation, where we tend to look for commonality rather than difference. And intersectionality says to us, we have to name and acknowledge differences in order to be able to engage in spaces and situations that are life-giving. And it requires of us an attentiveness, an attentiveness to detail. So um, attentiveness to language. So how is our language ableist? How is our language? We've gotten good at the kind of patriarchal language, and certainly our hymnody and our scriptures have helped us a bit in terms of playing with language, but language around ableism, language around the the challenge of language of light and dark, language, language we're accustomed to, like black hole, black ice, all those kinds of language that in some ways um, people who look like me hear them in very negative ways because the black is often associated in our culture with with negative, right? And even the language of in the black, and I know it's a it's a economic term, and most of us aim in our church to be in the black, but one wonders at time if that notion of being in the black comes out of the transatlantic slave trade. And so our collective, a sense of uh, being in the positive side of the ledger may have come out of that. I don't know. Sometimes one wonders. The other thing is that if we're going to think seriously about intersectionality, the question is, what is our appetite for change? And some of us want to, again, it's back to that question of agenda, whose agenda? Some of us want a kind of a look, but without change. And so I think it's important for us to understand that intersectionality invites us into a place of change. And so one of the questions for us is, what's our appetite for change? And that intersectionality, we can't engage intersectionality without a commitment to do advocacy and to work for justice. And that's a critical part of engagement with this. So I think in the end, what intersectionality invites us to do is to clarify what is the conversation we want to have. So are we talking about inclusion and we're trying to find spaces to include others? Or are we serious about the fact that what we just not merely want to include others, but in the inclusion of others, we want to be attentive to the issues, the systemic issues that exclude even in our inclusion and therefore requires us to change. So I think as we embark on this conversation around intersectionality, it's going to be important for us to kind of think about what it is, what is the conversation, what is the issue. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share a quick video.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit, it is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
So Kimberly Crenshaw, who you just saw, is the person who kind of coined initially the theory of intersectionality, and it's about the kind of intersection of the complex um, social location, social identity that leads to marginalization of a particular individuals and communities. So it's important that what we're talking about when we talk about intersectionality is a complex um, interrelatedness intersection of identity and social location. So I'll back to share my screen. Sorry. So again, just a quick definition, the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Put it in another way, the experience of a Black lesbian woman is different from the experience of a white lesbian woman. The experience of a Black disabled gay man is different from the experience of a Black gay man or a white gay man, right? Because there is that intersection of complicated identity and issues of social location. So the question I think before you is, when you talk about wanting to engage in the issue of intersectionality, what does that mean for you? So what's your starting point? So this little diagram kind of shows the kind of complexity and interconnectedness. So there's the individual, there's a group membership, there's a social location, social context, and the systems of oppression, right? And at the individual level, there's a multiple kind of intersections around ability, gender, sexuality, language, age, race, class. All those things play into, and there's a interconnection to that. Plus, in a kind of a group membership. So, I'm a Black gay refugee. The intersections of that, and to parse that out, and to analyze, to kind of think about what that means. Each of those categories have their own system of discrimination built into it. So as a Black person, as a gay person, as a refugee, there are systemic challenges that are faced with that. So again, if you're thinking about intersectionality, you also have to think about the systemic issues that are at play in the intersection of what it means. And then part of it is to also identify what is at the core. So in terms of this conversation, in terms of this being, the Pi Day celebration, in terms of being affirming ministry. So, let's put sexual identity as kind of the center. Sexual identity issues, there are all kinds of systemic challenges to that identity. And then you complexify it with race, you complexify it with economics, you complexify it with gender, you complexify it with religion. So each of those pieces you have to attend to understand what it means, then what's the interaction, right? So sometimes in our affirming process, we make only the sexual identity issue central. And then sometimes we wonder why it is that it doesn't move beyond that, right? So in some ways, when I think about the history of the United Church of Canada and its commitment to inclusion, and I think about what happens on a Sunday morning here in Toronto, for example, and there are more LGBTQ folks at MCC than in all our United Churches combined on a Sunday morning in Toronto. So what's that about? There are more LGBT folks in the Black churches, and I can name a few in Toronto than are in our United Church services combined. And part of that is there are Black folks here in Toronto, I know, who prefers to go to churches that are oppressive around their sexual identity because there are other needs that gets met in that space. And so even just to kind of think about what that means in terms of the intersection of that. So again, just as I said earlier, what's the intersection, right? If we make
Michael, I accidentally muted you. You need to unmute yourself. Sorry about that.
No problem. So again, if we make sexual identity as the center, then we have to understand what the implications are of the other identities. So let me just quickly, and I got 1 minute and 4 seconds left.
Take
So,
your time, Michael.
sorry. One of the stories that come to mind when I think about intersectionality, kind of rooted in a kind of biblical, is Jesus and the woman at the well, right? So you have she's female. Her social location puts her in the context of being at the well at a particular time. There is questions in the story, depending on how you read the story, in terms of what her marital status is. And she encounters Jesus, and she's the one who says, "How come you, um, a man, asking me for water?" Right? Given her the social location. But what's interesting in this story for me is the way in which I think Jesus understands where her social location and identity places her, and engages her in a conversation which names the issues, but um, at the same time creates this sorry, and at the same time engages her in such a way that she's able to go back to the community which seems to have ostracized her, again depending on how you read the text, to say, "Come see a man who's told me everything." And so her sense of value and worth is as such that she's able to um, hold a space in the context of a community that has ostracized her. And again, it's this understanding, naming the location, naming, understanding the issues around that, and yet engaging in relationship in such way that 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 transformation happens. Story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman is also one of those stories. Social location, woman, straight outsider, um, you know, the social location, she's nothing but a dog in terms of the cultural values. Jesus understands, I think, all that at play. And yet, in the intersection, in the conversation, understanding the dynamics, transformation happens both for Jesus and the woman. And again, for me, that's one of the issues around intersectionality. It's not just a political thing to do, it's about transformation. And that's why my question to you is, what's your appetite for change? Because if you really take it seriously, then you're going to be changed by it. And so that's an important thing. One other one I thought I would just throw in there is Jesus and Zacchaeus. And we wouldn't necessarily think about Zacchaeus as he's a man, he's a wealthy man in some ways, but the intersectionality in this around Zacchaeus' social location. So what does Jesus do in the interaction with Zacchaeus, knowing Zacchaeus' social location? Because Zacchaeus is ostracized, partly because he's a co-conspirator with the system, and he's exploited that for his own benefit, right? And yet Jesus, in that interaction, brings something out of Zacchaeus which transforms Zacchaeus in the way that Zacchaeus says, if I've cheated anybody, which he has, I'm going to restore it. And then something happens, right? Jesus, understanding the dynamic, works relationally with him that brings about transformation. And I think that's a key thing. So let me just bring this to a bit of a close. So we know, so we've heard the numbers about people impacted by COVID, right? And what folks in Toronto in particular have been doing is saying, we want to understand what's behind the numbers, right? And as they're beginning to parse out the numbers, is the recognition that racialized communities are 1.5 to 5 times higher, have an impact of COVID, right? So what that has led to is strategies that are attending to the particularities of what it means to be racialized in this system when it comes to the pandemic. What that has further led to is that an understanding of the dynamics have led to the fact that people of color and indigenous peoples have historically been guinea pigs when it comes to medical trials. And so there's a huge vaccine hesitancy that exists among people of color. Like, there's a lot of my friends who look like me who don't want to go near the vaccine, right? And some of that is the historical sense of distrust. So what's interesting to me is that the city and the government is now recognizing that it has to tailor an approach to the vaccine because of vaccine hesitancy, recognizing how the impact happens, right? And then you get into the notion that one of the reasons why racialized communities are more impacted is that they're essential workers, and they're working low wage jobs and that kind of stuff. So you begin to see that there is some systemic challenges that leads to the impact of this pandemic on racialized communities. So I think the question for me then is, how do we do the our analysis around the intersection of sexual identity and whether it's gender, race, ability, economics, right? So are we prepared to pause and to ask a question? So if we are creating this space, affirming space for people in terms of their sexual identities, we know that there are multiple layers, complex layers of social location and social identity that impacts. So what does it mean for us? How do we start to think about, so what does it mean? What does it mean to be Black in Canada? And then to ask the question, so how does sexual identity play out in the Black communities? So let me play with that a little bit further. And I'll use the Black community because it's one I know well. And I'll use the example of Black Lives Matter, and I'll close with this. So um, in in the United States of America, Black Lives Matter is deeply entrenched in the church. In fact, segments of the Black church and the Black prophetic tradition in the church are the ones who are given leadership to Black Lives Matter in the U.S. In Canada, Black Lives Matter is led by a group of queer Black young women. And if you remember a couple of years ago, which I think some folks should be embarrassed, but a couple of years ago when Black Lives Matter brought Pride to a halt, and you can think about the outcry that happened, right? Because this white gay event was brought to its knees by a bunch of Black folks, and the conversation that happened there was not always helpful. Fast forward to the death of George Floyd, and here we are, where the issues of systemic racism has come to the fore. Anti-Black racism is the language of the day. And are you aware, and this is part of the awareness, are you aware that in Toronto, for example, none of the Black churches have come out and spoken in support of Black Lives Matter? Some of our traditional mainline churches have been struggling to figure out how to do that, but the Black church has been silent. Well, why is the Black church silent? Because the leadership is queer folks, and the Black church hasn't done its work or won't do its work around queer identity. And yet, the number of woke Black folks who are part of some of these Black churches is quite high, and they won't give any kind of leadership in that space around it. Why? Right. Secondly, a lot of our Black folks have, in an attempt to decolonize themselves, has thrown Christianity out. They don't want to have anything to do with the Christian tradition because they see the Christian tradition as the religion of the masters in terms of the legacy of the transatlantic slave. So here we are as church, wanting to draw attention or attract Black folks into our lives, when the fact is that many of the Black folks don't trust us, don't want to be in relationship with us, don't want to come near our doors. Third is to say that many of the Black folks like a style of worship that has rhythm. And they would rather be in a context of a place where their sexual identity is preached against Sunday after Sunday, but they get to worship in a way that in other ways they find satisfying and things. So, you talk about intersectionality, and if you talk about the engagement of Black folks, you're up against folks who don't trust us in terms of religion, and folks who, even if they'd come near us, don't feel like they've been to church because of the style of our worship. So again, all I'm saying is that as you begin to think about how you engage in the process of intersectionality, it has to be about, are you willing to change? Because the folks who may come to you will be looking for something different than what you have to offer. And often our perspective is come and be like us rather than come and change us. Let me stop there. Lots of information, lots of stuff overload, and I'm sure some of you want to get at me, but we want to invite you into some small groups.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that it's a big topic. So 20 minutes is not a lot of time to fit all of that in. So yes, we're going to take some time for groups. Michael sent me the questions yesterday, and I'm actually going to put them into the chat box here. And they're big questions, so I don't want you to feel like you have to get through all of them. Do what you can in the time you have. We are recording this, and I'm going to put it on our YouTube page. It'll be unlisted, which means you'll need the link to get there. But that way you can share this with your congregations, and the questions will be there, and you can have further conversations with your own congregations on your own time. So let me get these questions in here and send them to.
I can also post them on the screen.
Okay. Okay, so they're in the chat box. And I think the chat box will follow you into your groups. There are 43 of us, so there'll be 5 people in a group. What is that, 8, 9? 9 times 5 is, I've lost my times table. 8. We'll make 8 groups here.
Deborah, there was just a question in the chat. Are the small group discussions being recorded?
No, the small groups are not recorded. Thanks for asking that. Welcome back, everybody. I know that was not a lot of time, so hopefully you got some good conversation in there. We're going to take about 10 minutes now to share as a large group, and then there's a lot of us. So if you want to raise your hand, which for some of us will be at the bottom of our screen, it says reactions. Some of us, it might be at the top of our screen. There's a reactions button. In there, there's a way to raise your hand. if you would like to speak. If you have some ahas you'd like to share, if there's a question you might like to ask that of Michael, maybe from his conversation, we'll just take about 10 minutes if you'd like to do some sharing with us. Callie, I saw your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Deborah. I just want to thank Michael very much for the graphics and the illustrations and the questions, because I think those will be really constructive for us to work through in the future. And I took pictures of them, and I'm really looking forward to working through those with our affirming committee. So many thanks for the talk, Michael, and also the inspiration and the guidelines.
Anybody else? I don't see any other hands up.
Yeah, this is Barb.
Oh, Barb.
In our group, there was a useful suggestion for a conversation starter of, and that'll be very useful at each place because we're just starting the process. But to think of a crosswalk, including like the one where you can cross any direction when the light changes, and to use that image to talk about our own intersectionality, to get into the wider conversation, about whose agenda is this.
Thank you, Barb. Anybody else? Anything you want to share from your group?
I can't raise my hand since I'm a co-host, but
Oh.
one of the things that our breakout room talked about a bit is how when churches become affirming, there's often a conversation around, or start the affirming process, there's often a conversation around what to focus on, and how a lot of affirming committees decide to focus on the LGBTQ plus community because of the history and how that impacts people. I was wondering if you could talk at all about how churches can focus on the LGBTQ plus community or choose who they're focusing on without excluding members within those groups. Because when we think about the LGBTQ plus community, we can focus on the LGBTQ plus community, but not just white people in the LGBTQ plus community, and kind of how that conversation can happen.
So I guess part of my response to that is it's just important to be clear, and just trying to say that if sexual identity is the the core, then the complexity of inclusion of others. So in some ways, it's always easier to kind of talk about that in terms of who we are. So this is who we are. We're a white middle class community with certain social values, blah blah blah, and that in some ways our affirmation, a space will be a space for those folks, and then not sweat the rest, because I think if you really want to be totally inclusive of the others, then it puts you in tension, because it's not simply a saying everybody's welcome. So just a quick example. So I'm a gay man. When I walk into, I don't even pay attention to, and this is me, I'm not saying this is everybody, this is me. when I walk into any space, the thing which I look for is, are there people that look like me, right? And so I know what to expect when I walk into a space when there's not people that look like me. And I will make a choice that this is not a safe place for me, right? So even though it's a safe place around my identity as a gay man, it's not necessarily a safe place around my reality as a Black man. So the challenge is we don't have relationships with Black communities so that we are understanding what's going on. Those folks aren't at the table when we're talking about becoming affirming. And so we can only do it out of our framing. So part of it for me is to say, stop sweating it because it's way too complicated. And unless you're prepared to change, it's what you end up doing is feeling guilty that others aren't included, when the reality is to include others means a massive shift. And so we're always contesting. So my illustration around the flag is one of those contested space. Symbols are important. It's important to have the symbol, but in having the symbol, it makes the space contested, not for straight people, but for other gay people, right? So everything you do has this level of, it's complex, it's thing. Be clear, this is our context. Yes, we would like to be broader than we are. The reality is that we don't have, those folks aren't among us. We don't know them well enough to know what they need, so that when we move in one direction, we may actually be creating spaces that alienate them, right? And whether it's, you know, gender issues, ability issues, it's like churches which says everybody's welcome, and there's no easy way to get into the building, right? Or even everybody is welcome, but if you are in a wheelchair and you want to participate in the service, you can't get up to the platform, right? So so those things speak, those are symbols, just as the flag is a symbol, those things are symbols. So I think, that's why my question to begin, what's your appetite for change? And what's your appetite to actually wrestle with concepts that we take for granted? So safe space is always a contested reality. It doesn't help, but I think it's just complicated, I think.
Hello?
Sorry, I'm sorry. Yes, but Elizabeth had her hand up. Do you still want to say something, Elizabeth?
And Mavis had her hand up.
Yeah, I see that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Michael, I would really welcome you speaking to one or both of the two things I want to raise with you. Number one, and this is as someone who's been served an affirming congregation and part of Affirm for a long time. I'm struck with how we focus on individuals, thinking about including individuals. And increasingly, I'm aware that in our congregations, there are parents and grandparents and sisters and brothers and children for whom the issue of sexual identity, race, class, are very real and very close. And I just wonder if you would like to speak to our need to broaden and understand that even when we look out at a congregation and it looks like somebody's missing, that there may well be people who are for whom this matters a lot, and they need to hear. That's one thing. And the other thing is, having served in a affirming congregation that was the only one in the community, it was our experience that other United churches were really happy for us to be the affirming congregation. and sent people to us, especially when the marriage policy, early days of same-sex marriage. We got all kinds of folks from other United Churches that didn't have to deal with the issue because we were there. So I wonder if you want to speak to how affirming congregations relate to their neighbors, or do you have a word for those neighbors who might be really happy to have that different neighbor that they don't have to engage in the justice work or the transformation you're calling us to?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I think to the first question, that this is, my point about being attentive, and the more we can be attentive. So in some ways, and I think if, two things: be attentive and be clear, right? To your point, that we've come out of a tradition of some folks who have adopted racialized Indigenous kids, and there are issues in that. So to your point, they themselves don't look that, but they have families, right? And so it's how to be attentive to them and their stories to kind of say, so um, how would your child feel about being in this space, right? Because in some ways, it's about them also kind of helping us as a whole kind of stuff. I think that's one thing. I think secondly, I would say that one of the lackings in our experience is that we don't have relationship with the communities of people we claim we want to engage, right? And so in some ways, I think it's just so important that if we're going to do this work and we want it to shape in a certain way, that we look for all the opportunities of building communities, because in some ways, those community voices to help us say here, and and I would say, so if you want, I'll push your thing a little bit, Elizabeth, to say that, so if you want to be totally inclusive, and you name, okay, the intersection of race and sexuality, build relationship with some racialized people. They don't necessarily need to be members of the church, but how do you invite them into your conversation, into your discussion, to help you kind of say, here's the pieces we're working out. What does that look like? What does it feel like, right? And again, some of those people are in the pews, and so if you're attentive to who's in the pews, what their life experience, that kind of thing. I think in terms of the neighbor thing, I think it's a broader systemic issue for us, and folks who may have listened in on my lecture last Friday, that the reality is that we have nurtured our folks to believe that the work of justice is optional. It's not essential to their identity as disciples. And we may contest the language of discipleship, but it's not those people who need to be doing this. It's all of us, because by our baptism we are called into ministries of partnering with God in mending God's world. And so I think it's a larger question for us of how do we begin to reshape the imagination, because in the United Church, even though we pride ourselves on this justice-seeking institution, we're not an institution that has helped everybody in the pew to understand that the engagement of justice is not an option. It's not for those left-wing people. It's for all of us to work about transformation and healing in the world. So.
All right, Mavis, and then Harold.
There was a point, Michael, where you were saying that if a person walks into the congregation and doesn't see themselves, someone like themselves represented, well, Adam Kilner, he's both gay and Black. He's our minister. He's right there at the front of the church when we can have a church service. He's been there for years. We do not have Blacks in our congregation. I think I've only once seen one show up, and when I joined, he chose not to. Yeah, it might be the music and the enthusiasm, and we don't dance in the aisles, but we do have an example very clearly there of an individual who is inclusive on both levels and who is greatly admired in our church. So that was the first thing that struck me about what you said. I don't know how we overcome that, and I'd like to know. The other thing I'd like to ask you, the young people who were in our Affirm committee very much wanted us to broaden our scope to not just be affirming for the LGBTQ2+. They also wanted it to include inclusiveness and affirming for people of color and different backgrounds and different races. And that seems to have been a stumbling block for some of the individuals who are very, very keen just to try and handle step one, which they think might be the LGBTQ. Can you advise that? Like, should we divorce the thing? Should we make it totally inclusive? It might be overwhelming for some committee members, and I just don't know the answer. So I'm asking.
So just quickly, because I realize our timing, I would say that, you know, Adam is a rarity, that again, and probably I may be over, the reality is that folks that I know who look like me look for people like them in leadership in the life of the church. So that's one issue. Secondly, I think what often happens is that people who look like Adam are in communities that are not predominantly, that don't have a large percentage of Black population. So in the core of the city of Toronto, with one of the largest Black population in the country, there are no Black ministers in any United Church. So if I live in the core of the city as a Black person and I walk into a United Church, I will not see myself reflected. We have about 12 Black ministers in Newfoundland and Labrador. In Nova Scotia, we just had a Black DLM minister in rural Nova Scotia, not even in Halifax where the Black population are. So there's something about the fact that in communities that are where people who look like me live, we don't see ourselves in the leadership of the church, and that's important. That's one dynamic. The other dynamic is worship style, all that kind of thing. And I know Adam is hip and does all kinds of music, but there are other factors that play into that. And I think to your second question, I think it's be clear, be clear, be clear, be clear. What I'm trying to say to you is that the intersectionality of sexual identity and other forms of oppression requires a lot of work. And so I think if you're not prepared to do the work, then I think it's okay to say, given who we are and given our capacity, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to do a damn good job at it, and not sweat that we're not doing everything. We can't do everything. What we need to do is do what we do and do it well.
Okay, Harold.
Thank
you. Yeah, so I really appreciate excuse me, I really appreciate the concept of intersectionality and the sensitivity with which it's been developed. I thought there was one thing perhaps missing, and that would be theological intersectionality. That is, we may have people appear in our churches who don't have a long United Church background. They may be Asian, they may be Filipino or Korean, for example. And they may have a more evangelical theological stance, or maybe they do have a long United Church history and they may feel that way. And they're concerned about whether homosexuality can be justified biblically. we still need somehow to be sensitive to them, and that would be that's a very difficult kind of inclusivity in the United Church. So I'd be interested to hear if there are comments about that, perhaps from Michael.
Harold. Yeah, so hence my starting point that it's complex and it's complicated, and you need to be clear about what. So for instance, part of the work, one of the pieces of work I've done in my time in the General Council is to work with Methodist migrant communities that are coming into the United Church, that are in Canada. And because they're Methodists and they're family in some ways, we have worked hard to try and find a space for them in the United Church, in their own space, as it were. So we have a Ghanaian Methodist church, Ugandan church, we have Filipino, we have Zimbabwe Methodist communities, and appreciating the fact that they aren't where we are at in terms of our understanding, particularly around LBGT issues, is to try and say, you're welcome. We're inviting you into being part of us. We know you're not where we are at, but we're asking for respectful conversation. And then it's a tension you have to live with. It's a tension you have to live with. And I remember a few years ago being with the Ghanaian Methodists, and as a gay man, standing up and saying to them, we're not expecting you to sign on the dotted line where we are, but we know that we want you to be part of us, and know that what we're asking for is respectful conversation. A few years ago, when Gary Patterson was the moderator, the presiding bishop of the Ghana Methodist Church was here for a visit. And we had intentionally put into the bulletin, we had a service at the Ghana Methodist congregation. In the bulletin, it clearly said that Gary was married to Tim. And at one point in time during the service, the presiding bishop reached over and gave Gary a hug. And he didn't have to say anything else. But just the symbol of saying, as a presiding bishop and knowing who this man is, we're brothers, use that kind of language, which shifted because the leadership of the church had said, don't sweat this. So I think I think sometimes we live with this notion that it's easy, let's just welcome people, right? And my question is, whose agenda? Because the diversity that exists, right? We often talk about the United Church as being a big tent theologically. Is it really? And to live in that big tent with the tension theologically is also part of what we need to wrestle with. And so, folks, all I'm saying is there's lots of opportunity, but it ain't easy. It requires a level of discipline on our part to think through the issues, or to be open that if we go where we want to go, it's going to be chaotic before it gets smooth. And are we prepared to live in the chaos of what that looks like? So.
Thank you, everybody. That's all the time we have for questions. I am going to pass it on to Judy, but before I do that, there will be a YouTube link, and I will send it out to, give me a few days to get it out there. And we'll send it out to whoever those people who invited other, like if you haven't gotten the link yet, just contact one of us and we will send it to you. Again, thank you, everybody. And I'm going to pass it on to Judy for some closing words.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you, Michael. I really want to thank you for just a stimulating, insightful, thoughtful, informative conversation. I've learned a lot, and there's so much for us to think about. I'm excited to take some of the things back to our committee and start discussing them. I think in particular, just the appetite for change within the church. I think we need to be clear on that, and also to be clear on what the conversation is that we want to have. Anyway, a lot of food for thought, and I thank you very much. It's been tremendous. And thank you all for participating as well. It's been great to have the conversation. Hopefully the next time it will be in person. Anyway, thank you so much.
Blessings, everybody.
Blessings to you.
Yeah, real coffee. Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.